All right, welcome back to a classic. So this season is not actually going to be a season. We're just going to perpetually run it because we've got heaps of people lined up. We got surfers, we got fishers, we got spearos, we got everything. We got some crazy stories, and we're going to also kick it off this year with the fresh. So we've got these stories. Geoff Doig wrote this one. He's a part of a classic, and he's lived some crazy life experiences. And we've written this story together, and we put it out on the website. It's free on the website if you want to check it out with the photos at www.aclassic.co. But I want to do this story because if anyone out there has got these crazy stories similar to this one, whether it be fishing, surfing, whatever, then send it in. Send an email to info@aclassic.co. Send a DM to my Instagram at Muntz or a classic, of course, and I'll keep an eye out for it. Although the classic inbox does get pretty busy. I'll put all the links in the bio below this story. But I want to kick it off because there's plenty of people out there with some wild stories, but they don't want to go on a podcast. They don't want to have a chat because obviously it can be a bit nerve-wracking. So if you've got a story, send it in. We'll touch base. We'll line it up. We'll get it written out and we'll just read it out like this. We can keep you anonymous or we can put your name with photos and whatever. So let's kick it off with the fresh. If you do like this, leave a comment below because we obviously want to give you guys what you want to hear. We're going to do stories like this one where they're just read like audiobook style. We're also got plenty of interviews coming up. And hopefully do some live podcasts as well. Get out fishing on a couple of boats and do some podcasts while we're out there and just have a bit of fun with it and just have a good time. So any suggestions, anything you want to see more of or less of, leave some comments, leave a review. It all helps. And without further ado, we will kick it off with the fresh Jewfish by the Ton by Geoff Doig. Firstly, the definition of a fresh in northern New South Wales major river systems back in the early yesteryears with the locals simply meant a river in heavy flood. It also meant to all the serious big Mulloway fishermen to dust off your big centerpin reel or alvy sidecast, load up your spool, pull out your heavy-duty Dewey stick and get ready to do battle. This is a story previously told in a short number of times through the various fishing magazines in past decades. Mostly they were pictorials with corny captions and the actual events that took place have not been told. This is a fishing tale that actually happened, true to the bone. The story was originally generated by Julius, who was the main man in orchestrating the catch. The pictorial especially was repeatedly printed in fishing magazines over the years. It became obvious by Alex and his father's photos that it was one of the best Mulloway catches in a 2-day session ever recorded. Most Jewy fishermen could only ever dream of catching one or maybe two of these fish in their lifetime. Some of you older fishermen may recall the fishing news cover shot heading Jewfish by the Ton, which was the fisherman's paperback Bible of fishing mags, or similar to what Track's paperback magazine was to surfers. On the cover, Fishing News showed part of the catch, with the culprits who took part in it. Another one of the bigger fish was featured on the front cover of the Australian Angler in May 1974, of Geoff Doig cradling a 65 to 70 pound Mulloway. Geoff was one of the 4 who fished in this particular fresh in the summer of 73. Geoff states when talking about that day, "I'll go through it firsthand, step by step as I still recall it clearly. It was an event never to be repeated as far as catching big Mulloway. One after the other in a fresh on the southern wall of the Southwest Rocks Breakwall at the mouth of the Macleay River in northern New South Wales. Big Mulloway had always been my target species from a young teenager, and I was about to go to heaven." So Alex Julius, myself, Barry Oxford and Kevin Eckles decided on a trip up to Hat Head, just south of Southwest Rocks. Alex had come across the name Hat Head a couple of years earlier from a golfing mate who frequented the tiny village for annual summer holidays. He'd eyewitnessed some great catches and urged Alex to check the place out, which he had done in previous years. His golfing mate was right. We'd first started fishing Hat Head a few years before this event with terrific catches of Spanish mackerel, big northern bluefin and the odd jewfish. On this particular fishing trip, the weather had turned as bad as it gets, as a tropical cyclone crossed the Queensland southeast coastline and turned into a horrific rain depression. It rained cats and dogs, dumping heavy rain for about a week straight, day and night, non-stop. We stayed confined in our little weatherboard house rental at the Hat, wondering where to fish once the seas subsided. The seas were huge, even in the southern corner of the Hat. Waves peeled off large sloping rock that can become one of the best surf spots on the entire east coast of Australia when all the elements line up. huge east-northeast swell, and south winds. Soon enough, they learnt from the local Kempsey AM radio station that the Clarence River at Yamba and Macleay River, Southwest Rocks, were in flood. Immediately, all 4 fishermen start thinking the same thing as soon as the broadcast was deployed. Oh shit, the Macleay will be in fresh and it's just up the road, Geoff states. Alex nods as he does. Alex was on it. The others, not too sure, were only in hope of what could happen. Excited, a plan was put in place. Daily, we would make the drive over to the Macleay River mouth to check conditions as the weather started to abate. You could drive your car almost to the end of the southern rock wall, Geoff recalls. On our first drive over to check conditions, we saw everything and anything spewing out of the Breakwall river mouth. Blown up dead cows, half farmhouses, barns and debris you could almost walk over. Still floating out to sea rapidly. The swell was still big, rising up, then dropping back down on its own tracks as the full force of the fresh held the waves up. Almost every living creature and fish that once sheltered in the Macleay was being or was already flushed out to sea. The luckier mullet took refuge in the thick mangroves upper reaches, if they could. I knew it would only be a matter of time before the outflowing fresh would subside. That one day will come about when the ocean's first high tide would finally reach the Macleay mouth, and that's the day the action would begin. After that, the very next high tide would only then be able to penetrate the slower outgoing tail end of the fresh and move back upstream like any normal tidal situation on the following tide. Timing is crucial, so was finding fresh bull mullet. What happens on that very first tide for every fish that was initially flushed from the river that was still alive, including big Mulloway, they then would enter the river mouth, disperse, and swim back upstream to their normal habitat. When the fresh would slow enough, those fish that had been flushed, including the Mulloway, smaller fish, luderick, brim, and of course, the mullet schooling thick around the backside tip of the Breakwall river mouth, waiting for the first tide to re-enter the river. It's that one day before the event of a natural seawater high tide to finally penetrate the river that it all comes together to catch big Mulloway. All fish, big and small, congregate thick and packed tightly together in the eddies, on the opposite side of the sea breakwall. Mullet schools, most venerable, try to fight the outgoing fresh, but stay still, swimming in their tracks. They become targets for more powerful swimming feeding Mulloway, an ideal situation for them to nail the mullet, which are not moving forward nor backwards. A perfect target they just can't miss. Eventually, as we found out as the fresh slowed, these big Jewfish would go nuts, crashing through mullet in huge schools around the breakwall mouth. Periodically, you would see directly out the front of the wall and also to the southern side of the breakwall, eruptions of water with mullet flying into the air, scattering in all directions as the big fish were crashing them on the surface. This is exactly how the first day ended up being. These massive flood conditions may only happen once in a decade or more. The 4 fishermen timed it perfectly to be there on the initial high tide that could almost reach the river mouth but not penetrate the river itself. The fresh was still strong and still spewing outwards, colliding with that first incoming high tide. The smaller fish, especially the schooling mullet, would get more tightly packed and in panic mode send out their skittish vibrations to the ambushing Mulloway, which would then attack. This particular day was becoming the greatest opportunity ever for any die-hard Dewey fisherman. Back in the day, for recreational fishermen and even pros, the 2 most prestigious fish to catch were big Mulloway and big reds, or the southeastern Australian snapper with those abnormal humped heads. These 2 species, old-time rockhoppers and offshore fishers, classed as 2 of the best fish to catch back in the times. Maybe occasionally tragling from boats and in some places off the rocks. And then there were luderick fishermen, which has tons of great history and another story. Tuna and kingfish came about much later in the 1980s onwards and were thought more to be cat food in those yesteryears. But it was always big dewies and big reds along the Australian eastern seaboard that were the prized target species. In any massive big fresh, it's a time for the dewy fisherman to settle his score and catch a big Mulloway, and in a feeding frenzy as it did this day. Big Mulloway were our fish to catch, even years prior to this as teenagers. If you were aware of how it worked, you caught fish shown in this pictorial accompanying this story. It's very rare, but if you're totally on it, as the floodwaters abate, checking the rock wall daily, watching and waiting for that sea tide to get nearer and nearer to the wall, you're on the right track for the real game and the eventual kickoff. Alex and I knew how it worked, having experienced one fresh before, fishing the flooding Clarence River at Yamba. In that fresh, we caught a couple of fish over 60 pound, but more so milked the locals for info, for when the right day was to fish, including all the right tackle to use to take these bigger fish down in freshes. We were apprentices to fishing rivers in a fresh for Big Mulloway, and we were keen to learn anything. On that trip, fishing the Clarence River's southern breakwall, we learnt to our surprise that some locals use lures. They use the old, well-known in the day, red and white feather jigs with a 60 to 80 gram head casting into the outgoing but slowly debating outflow of the river fresh. Of course, it had to be on that first good day when the tide was close enough to penetrate in the river. They slowly retrieve the jig back with the odd flick of their rod tip for a bit of lure action. The big fish were close to the front of the southeastern side of the wall where all the smaller fish congregated, still unable to penetrate the river, just as it unfolded later when we fished the Southwest Rocks fresh. Yamba was also the place we learnt of the chairleg lure, which most all big Mulloway back in the heyday were caught on in a fresh at Yamba. The chairleg lure was really something else. Believe it or not, it kicked ass, and it caught fish. It had an action almost identically imitating a struggling mullet swimming against the outgoing fresh to get back upstream. Alright, this was the ingenious way the chairleg lure worked. The lower part of a square chair leg was cut off about 9 to 10 inches or 23 to 25 centimetres up from its base. All kitchen and dining chair legs were a basic wooden design back in those days, with the legs being slightly tapered to the floor and squarish. So you had a 9 to 10 inch cut off the bottom of a chair leg. Sounds totally nuts. Homemade as they were, obviously created by obsessive Jewy fishermen who didn't have much coin. They were never shaped in any way. But once they were cut, we would then saw that piece of the chair leg directly down the entire length, dead center. So you now have two halves of the lower part of the chair leg you've sawn off. And a sturdy wire was created in a way where it was twisted and welded to form a small eyelet extruding out of the thicker mid-square end for the treble hook. Then the wire ran down the narrower square end of the chair leg and through the end with a small eyelet twisted and welded to put on your other treble hook on. This heavy wire was recessed into both halves of the cut-off piece of the chair leg, and it was then G-clamped and glued together with two large treble hooks already attached. No split rings were used for a solid connection from fish hooked up to fisherman. There was never any strong split rings back in those days anyway. Today's poppers or stick baits with recessed wire inside, connecting all hooks to fish and fishermen, are made similarly, but split rings are used. Split rings today can obviously be 4x strong. Now the beautiful thing here was because the chair leg lure had a thicker sawn-off square front than the lesser, narrower square tail, it swam perfectly in an outrunning fresh with a slow retrieve, and at times no retrieve, till it eventually swung around into the opposite side eddy. You didn't have to cast as far, as the fresh would take it as far as you wanted, and you just let line out to the area you saw mullet scattering and then hold off, and its action would begin immediately, retrieve or no retrieve. No painting, no colour, maybe slightly smoothed and sanded corners. They were the closest swimming piece of furniture that resembled a bull mullet struggling to swim. Wives would obviously be annoyed when a kitchen or dining table chair disappeared, but the square up by hubby was Jewy steaks the next month or more. Maybe even a bit of pocket money for mum if the fish was sold to the local co-op, which was often the case. The old boys were real fishermen, and you couldn't stop them when all the elements lined up and big Jewies would have been caught. If a chair could hide, they would in times like this. There was an old man that Alex and I met at Yamba's only petrol station early on that trip. It's probably still the only petrol station in Yamba. He saw the top of the car loaded with big rods and a long 14-foot cane gaff, and a conversation soon kicked off, and Jewfish became the subject. Local info is always by far the best info, and Alex politely drilled him for that info. Turned out this guy was an old-timer who fished the freshers at Yamba between pumping gas. Friendly and willing to offer any help, we learnt how to take on our first fresh. We still had a few days before the fresh would be slow enough to fish. He may have been the guy who put out the very first timber poppers that I ever knew of, which he called Bill's Bugs. Maybe it wasn't him, but Bill's Bugs were from Yamba. I still have a few today and used to buy as many as he could make to use to pop for GT in Sumatra when popping first began. That was 50 plus years ago, and I think Bill may have tried to transform the Jewy chair leg into a better lure to catch Mulloway, but it became the best ever GT lure of its time. He was friendly and offered any information to us about fishing this fresh. We had no chair leg lures though, and we had to settle on using fresh bull mullet bought from the local fishing co-op. I'm certain Bill has passed now, but he produced possibly the earliest and best blue water poppers which most designs are based on today. They worked everywhere I fished for GTs, in Australia, Fiji, and Sumatra, Indonesia, where they were certainly put to their test. He put one monster popper out that'd wear you down casting before you even locked up on a big GT. Back to the Southwest Rocks Fresh and that epic day. The 4 eastern suburbs fishermen arrived with perfect timing. The tide line was still about half a kilometre seaward from the breakwall. Wouldn't be long now before the first ocean green water was about to meet the Macleay River mouth. The skies were blue with an almost non-existent light southeast wind. Bad weather had completely gone. Weather-wise, it was going to be a cracker. Alex Julius's father, who was a professional photographer, arrived at Hat Head the day before and came to check on how fishing was going over on the wall, where we were later that morning. He recorded the action pictorially, which was possibly the most spectacular Jewfishing fishing day of all time. Alex fished, then later shot numerous photos of the catch as well at day's end. It's been 5 decades and the pictorials and articles are still occasionally published and stated as being the best breakwall Jewfish haul ever. Geoff explains, "We had run across from the Hat 3 days straight, checking conditions, and saw the blue water line meeting the outgoing brown fresh still out very wide off the breakwall. Each day it was getting closer to the river mouth. We had the timing perfect, and on the 3rd day, Alex and the rest of us were armed up and ready with big gear and baits. On arriving that morning, we just knew it was going to happen. The day before, we jagged mullet around the Milo factory at Smithtown, so we had plenty of 1.5 to 2 pound or 1 kilo fresh bull mullet. I'd also brought with me another 12-foot Butterworth blank rod that I had built with a 6.5-inch deep spool side cast alvy, 40-pound mono line mounted on a low winch mounting, typically for side casting reels such as those alvies. Why I mention this? Well, that story comes up soon. The 3rd day. Today's the day. We arrive at the southern breakwall about 150 yards from the end and we get a flat tyre. We all get out of the car and I just call out, I smell Jewfish. Mulloway have a distinct smell when the fresh water mixed with salt water and light onshore southeast winds. That smell came straight to me and I knew we were on. I ran out to the end of the breakwall, leaving the others while they milled around the 1964 Holden station wagon changing the tyre. We could have driven further up to the end of the breakwall, which was intended so to be closer to the fishing without tackle and bait. I could definitely smell Mulloway, and the tide had just changed. The greener water only about 700 metres out, and I saw mullet raining and scattering out of the water about 300 metres out. I couldn't help myself and rigged a bait. Hefty 1.5 pound bull mullet, fresh as a daisy. I already had my 3904 Sportex rod and 7-inch alvy centerpin rigged on the roof racks of the EH that I'd done the night before at Hat Head. I'd rigged them up in my own special way to imitate a mullet struggling to penetrate up the river mouth, similar to the chair leg lure. It was a real deal side swinging these big baits on centerpins, and I used a special technique to cast them, big or small. A large homemade shaped bobby cork sat 2 metres up from the mullet. No lead. The bobby cork had a piece of soft plastic tubing glued down the centre where the line would be threaded through and held in place by a timber golf tee plug, plugged into the bottom to stop the cork slipping. That wouldn't damage the line. I baited up and the others weren't that happy that I was going to get first crack at it. But I had a bull mullet, rigged, baited and ready to go. 2 fine wire Sealy French 10-0 hooks tied 6 inches apart. The second hook tied off from the eye of the first hook. First hook I just pushed through the chin of the mullet, extruding out above. The second 10-0 I fed through the belly of the mullet and extruded out of its bum. For the record, Sealy French hooks were a finer wire hook, but I'd never straightened one. Back then they were very hard to come by and had to be ordered, which I did from Bob Nivens in the city of Sydney. They don't exist these days, but they were by far the best big Mulloway hook you could use. We all used them. I baited up before they had the wheel off the EH and ran to the northeast corner of the breakwall and swung my alvy centerpin and big bully mullet into the still outgoing fresh water. I then, while pulling off possibly 80 metres of line, hopped across the boulders and over to the southeastern side of the breakwall, a mere 10 metres away, and held off, not letting any more line out. I then held my rod tip as low to the water as possible, letting out this 80-odd metres of slack line as quickly as the outflowing water would take it, and it caused a huge bow in the line from the bobby cork to where I held off on the southeastern side corner of the breakwall. This caused the bow in the line to tighten up with the outgoing fresh and caused the bobby cork and the mullet to be trolled across the surface of the water by the tightening bow in the line. I wanted to keep the mullet up on the surface where all the schooling mullet were still battling the surging fresh. Before the boys had changed the flat tyre, I was hooked up and running past them at the car and down the rock wall to jump onto the beach and do battle with a good 50-plus pounder. It would not have been 15 minutes after I baited up that I hooked up. I remember they were pissed off that I'd left them with a flat tyre. I was the youngest by 3 to 5 years and always got hammered anyway by the crew. I was there to catch Big Jewy, and the clock was ticking. If the fish were hooked on the southeast corner of the wall, where most of the bait was held up, and the Jewy ran straight out to the southeast, then it was better to fight the fish from the beach. So I'm 80 metres down the southern side of the wall, where it met the beach. I'd run down the wall, letting line out as I still wanted to keep pressure on the fish, and then scramble down onto the beach. I ran due south along the beach a good distance, playing the fish as I went. When I thought I was far enough down the beach, I'd sit down, plant my feet in the sand, and do battle. The further away from the breakwall, the better, and a much safer way to land your fish on sand. After a big Mulloway's second run, they're pretty much spent. Gaffing big fish off a breakwall with swell can be sketchy, at the least, let alone landing the fish. And so it was. All the others immediately used that same rig, and we possibly made history for that one-day Jewfish Bonanza on rod and reel, fishing our second only fresh. The great part of the day was the teamwork. Besides me running off, leaving them with a flat tyre initially, switching from fishing to gaffing each other's fish on that day. Gaffing is fun in itself. Gaffing a fish that size and fighting a fish that size is almost one and the same. Both catching and gaffing are a big part of the experience. You could never let your buddy down with a bad gaff shot or a miss. Once that was done, you left your mate, gaff and fish, and ran as fast as you could back to rebait your rod and cast into that last day of outsurging fresh to get hooked up once again, almost immediately. And that we did in rotating concession. At one stage, I just had to try casting a lure into these fish to see how crazy the bite really was. I quickly switched and rigged up my Butterworth and side cast with 40-pound mono. I always carried a few irons that were first given to Alex by Joe Gospel to initially try at the hat. I tied on a chromed iron lure called a coffin, shaped exactly like a coffin. 50 years on, I still have a dozen I keep in Fiji, just for memorabilia. There's so many lures around these days that seem to catch way more fishermen than fish. I ran down to cast directly off the front of the wall where I could see a panicking school of scattering mullet about 50 metres out. I cast with my eyes on the mullet and my lure lands just behind them. I quickly fold the side cast back to its lock position. 3 cranks on the reel and I got whacked and locked up briefly. Another 4 to 5 cranks immediately after that hit and get smashed again with another big hit. This time I was hooked up solid and later landed a 53-pound Jewy. I just had to try that once and test Joe's coffin lures on these fish. But I reckon anything you'd pull through the water that day smashed, as I later found out. One cast with a lure and one fish, and that was enough. I did what I wanted to do, went back to bait fishing, with the heavier rods and bigger baits. I've always believed big baits, big fish. Now here's one of the best parts of the day, and I recall it clearly because I was on the end of what went down. I went back to my faithful bobby cork, 2-hook rig and bully mullet for bait. To shorten this all up, I did the usual. Cast off the north end of the breakwall into the outgoing current and let the line out as I had been doing. Then I'd go to the southeastern side to hold off on the bowed line to drag my bobby cork and mullet across the surface. The bobby cork was coming around the front quickly due to the tightening bow in the line, myself holding off but winding in very slowly at times to speed up the trolled mullet. Then suddenly the rod was almost torn out of my hands and I look out to see this monster Mulloway in midair. I thought I was hooked up on this thing. What had happened was the bobby cork coming around a little quicker than usual across the surface because I was retrieving the bowed line. The big fish had crashed the bobby cork and it was clenched in its mouth and not letting go. It totally cleared the water on the initial bite, coming straight up underneath the bobby cork and would have been every bit of 80 pounds. I saw the whole thing happen and couldn't believe its size. The fish tore line from my center pin whilst palming the spool with my right hand. Then obviously releasing what it had in its mouth, spat it out after about 20 seconds. But the sight of that I'll never forget. It was the size of that fish that totally freaked me out. Why didn't he crack my bait? Just kept rolling around in my head and haunted me for months. Its teeth marks were embedded in either side of the bobby cork, and these bobby corks were shaped out of corked hand lines about 8 inches or 20 centimetres long, which we'll see in some of the photos. The sun was setting in about 1 hour. On the next drift after that huge Mulloway spat the cork, a 64-pound Mulloway nailed my bait, and once again off the southeastern corner and headed seaward. I ran as I did on 8 other occasions to the beach to fight the fish. There was only one fish I'd landed that day, inside the wall, when the outgoing fresh had almost stopped due to the first tide arriving near the mouth of the river. The fish ran upriver. That 64-pounder was landed off the beach, as most were. I forget who gaffed it, but it may have been Kevin Eckles. Dragging the fish back solo as the gaffer, he rushed back to the wall to bait up himself and get back in amongst that final hour's fishing. I did get back in time to the car for one last bait up and drift. Immediately as the bobby cork and bait got midway around the front of the wall, holding off as I did, crash, bang, and wow, this was like none of the other fish I connected with. It went deeper, and at first I thought it was a shark. Fortunately, it sort of ran east-southeast, but I did the usual and ran like hell down the wall to the beach. The reason I ran quicker than ever was the fish was heading seaward, more easterly, and there could have been the possibility of him swimming more to the northeast, and that's exactly what the fish did. I was up the beach further than I'd run usually because I could see that the line was now pointing across the southern wall under the sea level, but extremely close to the tip of the southeast corner of the rocky wall. In these freshers, we all use heavy line on our center pins, and I had 60-pound Mako mono, a much harder line that could withstand a little bit more abrasion from rocks, better than other monos. By this time, I almost had the fish around the southeast corner of the wall, but not completely. I made the decision to point the bone, which is just walk backwards slowly and further south along the beach, not even holding the rod up. It was bust or dragged the almost expelled big fish around the wall onto a safe and sandy bottom off the southern side of the wall. I couldn't believe it, and he came around very slowly, and it could have gone bad either way. I then backed off completely on the pressure and held my rod up to absorb the head shakes of the fish. Now knowing he was now on sand, but also knowing my line had surely rubbed on the breakwall corner, which I had felt, and now I took it very easy. The end result you'll see in this pictorial. Alex said it didn't go over 70 pounds, but for some reason, that's what I remember when I weighed it back at Jordan's, the local pro fish show at Hat Head. It doesn't really matter anyway. Any Mulloway over 40 pounds is considered a big fish. But the beautiful thing about this trip was the fishing with top mates. We all caught fish, and it was a great team effort. We were all members of the Sydney Mascot Anglers Club. We caught our two biggest fish an hour apart just before sunset. Check out the front cover of Australian Angler in May 1974. I ate the biggest Jewfish cutlet off that last big fish that I've ever attempted to eat that night. No way I could finish it. Not even half the cutlet would fit on a plate. And big Mulloway do taste good, if they're not riddled with worms, which many are. This one, our biggest fish, didn't have a worm in it. That was the best fresh we all ever fished. We did have success at Yamba and Stockton breakwalls and other freshers, but nothing matched this, and probably still hasn't today. It was just one of those once-in-a-lifetime catches. That Southwest fresh, we caught an amazing 22 fish for 1,028 pounds in total. The following day, the fresh had slowed down enough for the second high tide to re-enter the river, and we only caught one fish. The night after the first day of the catch, the first high tide re-entered the river mouth. All small fish and big fish initially flushed from the river dispersed back upriver to their usual habitat. Sean Dixon, a mascot angler in Sydney, heard of the first day's catch, jumped in his car to arrive the following morning only to find the fish had moved upriver. I think even still today, no one has come close to a catch of Mulloway like that first day. Well, not off the rocks or the beach, or any breakwall, that is. Fishing's always doing your homework, considering weather and wind, and waves, the elements, and knowing absolutely everything about your target species, as well as sourcing local knowledge. That's how we found out where we could catch our mullet, which was at the Milo Factory hot water outlet at Smithtown, which was sheltered up in a small tributary. We could have fished into the night that first day, but we had no more room in the car to put our fish. Nor did we need any more. We were all shot ducks, exhausted. So it was really only one day's fishing. Only one fish the following day, which we knew was hardly worth the effort. We knew the next tide, that night of the first day, all the fish would start moving back upriver and in a hurry, which they did. Our timing was spot on. When leaving that day, we filled the back of the 1964 E.H. Holden station wagon, back seat laid down and full to the roof with Jewfish. Jordan, the local pro fisherman at Hat Head, took the fish off our hands. I'd caught a total of 9 fish that first day. We all caught solid fish. My last 2 fish in the last hour of daylight were my 2 biggest Jewies to date. And they capped off the Jewfish haul of a century, I reckon.